Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be returning to Pragmatism, the classic writings, for another look at another essay. Last episode was an overview of Pragmatism by John Dewey. This episode is another essay by John Dewey. This one called The Practical Character of Reality. And it was included in a book by the name of Essays, Philosophical and Psychological, in honor of William James. And that was published in 1908. So that was around the heyday of William James. And apparently they wrote a book, or they compiled a book of essays in his honor. I don't have that book. I've never heard of it before seeing it referenced here. Probably a decent book to have, but like I said, I've never seen it available online. Of course, I haven't really searched, but I wouldn't mind getting that one and seeing what it's all about. In the meantime, I have this one essay from that by John Dewey, and I'm going to examine that essay in today's episode. This essay, I have to admit, confounded me a little bit. I found it difficult, perhaps a little incoherent. It's hard to say whether it's me just failing to understand the essay or whether John Dewey just writes in a somewhat incoherent manner, or the things that he writes about are sort of incoherent ideas. I'm not sure that I'm prepared to say one way or the other. It may just be that I don't get this. I mean, it's not that I don't get it at all. It's just that parts of it seem like they don't make as much sense as I would like them to. Sometimes it seems like he's just restating things that are obvious in a way that is partly more complicated and perhaps partly more technical. But when you step back and look at it from a bit of distance, perhaps what he's saying is just basic knowledge about how we think about things. But then, perhaps not. I'm not going to read the entire essay. It starts on page 275, ends on page 289, so 14 pages, not tremendously long. I'm not going to read it all, but I'm going to read enough of it, I think, that we can get a good handle of what the meat of the essay is. I tried to select the sections to read that I felt like conveyed the most important points. And I'm going to attempt to make sense of this as I go through the 5 sections of the essay that I wanted to look at. So let me just go ahead and get started reading the first section here and see if I can understand what he is saying, what he's implying. He says, quote, "The theory of knowledge has been systematically built up on the notion of a static universe, so that even those perfectly free to feel the lessons of physics and biology concerning moving energy and evolution, and of history concerning the constant transformation of man's affairs, science included, retain an unquestioning belief in a theory of knowledge which is out of any possible harmony with their own theory of the matters to be known. Modern epistemology, having created the idea that the way to frame right conceptions is to analyze knowledge, has strengthened this view, for it at once leads to the view that realities must themselves have a theoretic and intellectual complexion, not a practical one. This view is naturally congenial to idealists, but that realists should so readily play into the hands of idealists by asserting what, on the basis of a formal theory of knowledge, realities must be, instead of accepting the guidance of things in divining what knowledge is an anomaly so striking as to support the view that the notion of static reality has taken its last stand in ideas about knowledge. Take, for example, the most striking because the extreme case, knowledge of a past event. It is absurd to suppose that knowledge makes a difference to the final or appropriate content of knowledge, to the subject matter which fulfills the requirements of knowing. In this case, it would get in its own way and trip itself up in endless regress. But it seems the very superstition of intellectualism to suppose that this fact about knowledge can decide what is the nature of that reference to the past, which, when rightly made, is final. No doctrine about knowledge can hinder the belief, if there be sufficient evidence for it, that what we know as past may be something which has irretrievably undergone just the difference which knowledge makes. Now, arguments against pragmatism, by which I mean the doctrine that reality possesses practical character, and that this character is most efficaciously expressed in the function of intelligence, seems to fall blandly into this fallacy. They assume that to hold that knowledge makes a difference in existences is equivalent to holding that it makes a difference in the object to be known, thus defeating its own purpose. Witness that the reality, which is the appropriate object of knowledge in a given case, may be precisely a reality in which knowing has succeeded in making the needed difference. This question is not one to be settled by manipulation of the concept of knowledge, nor by dialectic discussion of its essence or nature. It is a question of facts, a question of what knowing exists as in the scheme of existence. If things undergo change without thereby ceasing to be real, there can be no formal bar to knowing being one specific kind of change in things, nor to its test being found in the successful carrying into effect of the kind of change intended. If knowing be a change in reality, then the more knowing reveals this change, the more transparent, the more adequate it is. And if all existences are in transition, then the knowledge which treats them as if they were something of which knowledge is a Kodak fixation is just the kind of knowledge which refracts and perverts them. And by the same token, a knowing which actively participates in a change in the way to effect it in the needed fashion would be the type of knowing which is valid. If reality be itself in transition, and this doctrine originated not with the objectionable pragmatist, but with the physicist and naturalist and historian, then the doctrine that knowledge is reality, making a particular and specified sort of change in itself, seems to have the best chance at maintaining a theory of knowing which is in wholesome touch with the genuine and valid. End quote. Okay, so then you can see that it's certainly not simple material, and it's somewhat difficult to wrap your head around, or it's somewhat difficult for me to wrap my head around. But let's see what we can get out of this. The first thing he says in the part that I quoted here is that the theory of knowledge has been systematically built up on the notion of a static universe, so that even those perfectly free to feel the lessons of physics and biology concerning movement and energy and evolution and of history, etc., retain an unquestioning belief in a theory of knowledge which is out of any possible harmony with their own theory of the matters to be known. So what he's saying there is that the theory of knowledge is predicated on the idea that the universe is static, is a thing which is knowable once and for all. That knowledge is a reflection of a static universe, and he's saying that this is the case even amongst people who are perfectly capable of understanding that physics and biology concern change. In other words, the moving energy, the change of evolution. He mentions history concerning the constant transformation of man's affairs, and yet the people who study these things, who learn the lessons of physics and biology and history and understand all of the changes that these things go through, nevertheless retain this unquestioning belief in a theory of knowledge, a theory of knowledge built upon the notion of a static universe, and so therefore out of any possible harmony with their own theory of the matters to be known. So their things that they're studying continually reflect a changing universe, a universe in constant sort of flux and change, and yet their theory of knowledge always remains this theory of knowledge of a static universe, a sort of building up of knowledge upon previous knowledge, where the knowledge is a knowledge of a world that doesn't change. The theory of their way of understanding what knowledge is predicated on a static universe. He says the view is naturally congenial to idealists. In other words, the view of knowledge as being predicated on a static universe is congenial to idealists, but that realists should so readily play into the hands of idealists by asserting what realities must be based on this theory of formal knowledge, instead of accepting the guidance of things in divining what knowledge is. What does that mean? Let's look at this sentence again. This view is naturally congenial to idealists, but that realists should so readily play into the hands of idealists by asserting what, on the basis of a formal theory of knowledge, realities must be, instead of accepting the guidance of things in divining what knowledge is. Now that's a peculiar sentence. He says this is an anomaly so striking as to support the view that the notion of static reality has taken its last stand in ideas about knowledge. So the idea of a static reality driven out of every field of study except for ideas about knowledge. In other words, that's where this static reality theory is making its last stand. He says it's so strange that this view, which is naturally congenial to idealists, but nevertheless the realists continue to buy into it. Instead of, and this is the line that doesn't make an awful lot of sense to me, but I think this is important to at least attempt to pin down. What the realists should be doing is accepting the guidance of things in divining what knowledge is. What they're doing instead of that, so what they should be doing is accepting the guidance of things, in other words, the way things are, material reality, the things of the world, should be guiding them in their understanding of what knowledge is. Let's take the word divining and replace it with understanding. Instead of accepting the guidance of things in understanding or figuring out or divining what knowledge is, what they're doing instead is they are asserting what, on the basis of a formal theory of knowledge, realities must be. So they're making statements about what reality must be based on a formal theory of knowledge. What they should be doing is looking at what is, and therefore coming to understand what knowledge is by beginning with their observation of things, beginning with their observation of the world, and then understanding what knowledge is through that observation of things. Instead, they have a formal theory of knowledge, and they see the world through this formal theory of knowledge, and therefore they assert what reality must be. There's the difference. So I think we've locked that down, that sentence down a little bit. Moving on, he talks about a past event. He says, take for example the most striking because the extreme case, knowledge of a past event. Now, it's absurd to suppose that knowledge makes a difference to the final or appropriate content of knowledge. It's absurd to suppose, in other words, that the fact that you know something is affecting the thing that you know. Now, let's set aside for a minute some of the weird observational conundrums that arise in quantum physics. And how can we just set that aside? Because we don't entirely understand it. I think that's, or I don't entirely understand it, and I'm not so sure that anyone really understands it. And I also don't think it's entirely what we commonly say when we say that, oh, quantum physics tells us that when you observe things, it changes them. Well, I'm not that's a very simplistic way of explaining quantum physics. So, unless you're a physicist, it's probably best to just put that in your pocket for the moment. And let's think about just the regular day-to-day things that we encounter. What he's saying is that it's absurd to suppose that knowledge makes a difference to the final or appropriate content of knowledge, to the subject matter which fulfills the requirements of knowing. In this case, it would get in its own way and trip itself up in endless regress. In other words, knowing something affects what you're knowing affects your knowing of it, and so on to infinity. He says, but it seems the very superstition of intellectualism to suppose that this fact about knowledge can decide what is the nature of that reference to the past, which, when rightly made, is final. In other words, this fact that you can't let yourself get caught into an endless loop of knowing things affecting the things that they know, but you can't let that fact decide the nature of knowledge, the nature of that reference to the past, which, when rightly made, is final. He says next that no doctrine about knowledge can hinder the belief, if there be sufficient specific evidence for it, that what we know as past may be something which has irretrievably undergone just the difference which knowledge makes. So essentially, he's saying that when you know something about a past event, that past event is itself the product, if circumstances warrant, could be the product of other knowledge. Not the same knowledge, not your present knowledge about the past event, but the past event is itself adjusted and affected by knowledge. So the things that we're knowing, knowledge as a category, the fact of knowledge, past things, past people knew. To say that sentence again, no doctrine about knowledge can hinder the belief, if there be sufficient specific evidence for it, that what we know as past may be something which has irretrievably undergone just the difference which knowledge makes. Okay? So, it's entirely reasonable to think past events were influenced by knowledge, in the particular way in which knowledge affects things. So, that seems sort of pretty easy to accept, right? The past was affected by knowledge. Now you know about the past. You know about a thing that happened that was affected by something someone else knew about things that had previously happened. Right? I mean, the things that happen today are affected by our knowledge of things that happened before. Our knowledge of reality affects the ongoing happenings of the world. Okay, that's all seems pretty acceptable. Now, he does present a brief definition of pragmatism, where he says, arguments against pragmatism, by which I mean the doctrine that reality possesses practical character, and that this character is most efficaciously expressed in the function of intelligence, seem to fall blandly into this fallacy. He's got a footnote here after this definition of pragmatism. That definition being the doctrine that reality possesses practical character, and that this character is most efficaciously expressed in the function of intelligence. He's got a footnote saying this definition in the present state of discussion is an arbitrary or personal one. The text does not mean that pragmatism is currently used exclusively in this sense. Obviously, there are other senses. It does not mean that it is the sense in which it ought to be used. I have no wish to legislate either for language or for philosophy, but it marks the sense in which it is used in this paper. And the pragmatic movement is still so loose and variable that I judge one has a right to fix his own meaning, provided he serves notice and adheres to it. So that's interesting. He's essentially saying pragmatism is sort of still new and still in the process of being defined. So it's not that everybody understands pragmatism quite along this definition here, or that pragmatism isn't used in some other way, or that this is the official definition of pragmatism, or is how people ought to be using the word pragmatism. I think that's interesting because I'm of the opinion that pragmatism is still not thoroughly defined and remains to this day misunderstood and perhaps not accurately defined or developed. At any rate, one interesting sentence here shortly after that is where he says, if things undergo change without thereby ceasing to be real, there can be no formal bar to knowing being one specific kind of change in things. So the idea is things are changing, the world is changing. If we know that reality changes, if we know that things change without ceasing to be real, sure, something is one way, then it's the other way. There's something continuous. Otherwise, there could be no change if it wasn't something changing into something else. If you just had a sequence of things that weren't related to one another, that wouldn't be change. It would just be a sequence of different things. For something to change, there must be a thing underlying the change. So he says, if things undergo change without thereby ceasing to be real, there can be no formal bar to knowing being one specific kind of change in things. Now, clearly, you change when you learn something. Your brain changes. Knowing is a change. I've changed when I've learned something. My brain's changed. My disposition's changed. My mind is changed. But there's bits and pieces here that don't make quite as much sense to me. Where he says it's test. He says there can be no formal bar to knowing being one specific kind of change in things, nor to its test being found in the successful carrying into effect of the kind of change intended. If knowing is a specific kind of change in things, the test of its knowledge would be found, its test being found, in other words, the test of the truthfulness of this knowledge, its test is found in the successful carrying into effect of the kind of change intended. In other words, the knowledge of a thing should imply that something in the world is changeable in a certain way. Essentially, if you suspect there's a cat in the box and you open the box and you find the cat, right? You have knowledge that you learn that there's a cat in there. Someone tells you there's a cat in the box. You learn there's a cat in the box. Your knowledge that learning has changed you. Now you have an understanding or a suspicion or what you would proclaim to be knowledge. I guess at that point it's really a hypothesis. The test being found in the successful carrying into effect of the kind of change intended. So this knowledge of the cat in the box predicts some future change. In other words, it predicts that if I open the box, then I will find the cat. I will see the cat. And my seeing the cat, right, is a material change in my future knowledge. I will then know that I have looked here and seen the cat. There'll be a change, as I talked about last episode, in the cells inside my eyeball. There will be a change in the neural activity in my ocular regions of my brain. That's just a sort of simple spot to point to, but the whole experimental theory is based on if you do this, then this will happen, and you can measure the results of the things that you do. If you do this, then this will happen. The experiment is a test to see whether the change, the effect of doing something will be something else. If you do this, then this will happen according to the hypothesis. There's no other way to conduct an experiment other than to make some manipulation of the world and record the results and see what those results indicate. They must indicate some change from the condition of things prior to the experiment. If you run the experiment and you have no expectation that anything will change, you can't possibly measure what effect the experiment had, unless your intention is to indicate that there was no change, and then you measure and see that there was no change. Which I guess in a way kind of undermines the whole premise that John Dewey is making. because observation, proof, verification is not all just the phenomena of change. Now, you may change in that you've learned that nothing has happened. But to focus so exclusively on change, the sentence doesn't really, I don't feel, make as much sense as I would like it to. At any rate, moving on a little bit, where he says, if all existences are in transition, then the knowledge which treats them as if they were something, of which knowledge is a Kodak fixation, is just the kind of knowledge which refracts and perverts them. So if all existences are in transition, any attempt to know them in such a way that treats them as if they are not in transition is the type of knowledge which refracts and perverts them. But I think that most knowledge understands that things are changing. No one looks at a photograph of a plant sprouting out of the ground in its first moment of sprouting out of the ground, and because the photograph is a still image, thinks that that's what that thing is going to look like forever, if you know the process. And yet, if you know the process, you trust that the process is going to stay the same process for every seed that goes into the ground. And yet, if you understand evolution, you understand that, well, the process at one time for the ancestors of this plant, the process once upon a time was something different. And that in the future, given enough billions of years, the process may again be something different. You can know all of these things and still also know that at one moment in time, this is like this. This thing operates in this way. This thing has these constituent parts at this moment in time. And so I don't think there really is a theory of knowledge that forces the things that we know into a static view. And I guess I feel like there must be some strange straw man that Dewey is arguing against, because I don't think anyone presumes knowledge to be sort of knowledge of a static reality, when we are pretty sure that everything is always changing all the time. And yet some things change rapidly and some things don't. A car's location on the highway obviously is very much changing all the time, and nobody would think that because a car was in a certain spot that it's going to stay in that spot. But there are also things like the basic laws of reality, the basic laws of physics, mathematics, and so forth, that we don't really presume are changing or have ever changed. And so for that reason, I sort of fail to see what Dewey's arguing against here. It really seems as though he's arguing against a sort of straw man vision of knowledge as a snapshot of reality. But it's obvious that human history is affected by knowledge, and then is a series of actions and activities and things that happen, which then becomes knowledge for future generations, and that knowledge will continue to affect events, and events will affect knowledge, and knowledge will affect events. Now, maybe it's because it's over 100 years later, and John Dewey's ideas and pragmatism's ideas have become more common in the mainstream, but I can't imagine that anybody ever really thought that nothing was ever impacted by knowledge, that knowledge sort of stood outside of. I guess maybe in a Platonic, very Platonic vision, that there's this other idealized world, and that true knowledge is knowledge of this other idealized world, and all lesser knowledge is a sort of illusion. The knowledge of the things in the cave is not true knowledge, but the knowledge of the sun outside the cave is true knowledge. I suppose if you're going to look way back to a sort of Platonic idealism, you might say that John Dewey's argument against that Platonic idealism is valid, but I don't think people have believed in a realm of pure knowledge, of pure ideas outside of material reality for a very long time. So I don't know who John Dewey's arguing against, is my point. Anyway, continuing on from there, he says, quote, "Common sense regards intelligence as having a purpose, and knowledge as amounting to something." I once heard a physicist, quite innocent of the pragmatic controversy, remark that the knowledge of a mechanic or farmer was what the Yankee calls gumption, acknowledgement of things in their belongings and uses, and that, to his mind, natural science was gumption on a larger scale, the convenient cataloging and arranging of a whole lot of things with reference to their most efficacious services. Popularly, good judgment is judgment as to the relative values of things. Good sense is horse sense, ability to take hold of things right end up, to fit an instrument to an obstacle, to select resources apt for a task. To be reasonable is to recognize things in their office as obstacles and as resources. Intelligence, in its ordinary use, is a practical term, ability to size up matters with respect to the needs and possibilities of the various situations in which one is called to do something. Capacity to envisage things in terms of the adjustments and adaptations they make possible or hinder. One objective test of the presence or absence of intelligence is influence upon behavior. No capacity to make adjustments means no intelligence. Conduct evincing management of complex and novel conditions means a high degree of reason. Such conditions at least suggest that a reality to be known, a reality which is the appropriate subject matter of knowledge, is reality of use and in use, direct or indirect, and that a reality which is not in any sort of use, or bearing upon use, may go hang, so far as knowledge is concerned. No one, I suppose, would deny that knowledge issues in some action which changes things to some extent, be the action only a more deliberate maintenance of a course of conduct already instinctively entered upon. When I see a sign on the street corner, I can turn or go on, knowing what I am about. The perceptions of the scientist need have no such overt or utilitarian uses, but surely after them he behaves differently as an inquirer, if in no other way. And the cumulative effect of such changes finally modifies the overt action of the ordinary man. That knowing, after the event, makes a difference of this sort, few, I suppose, would deny. If that were all pragmatism means, it would perhaps be accepted as a harmless truism. But there is a further question of fact. Just how is the consequent action related to the precedent knowledge? When is after the event? What degree of continuity exists? Is the difference between knowing and acting intelligently one of kind or simply one of dominant quality? How does a thing, if it is not already in change in the knowing, manage to issue at its term in action? Moreover, do not the changes actively effected constitute the whole import of the knowledge, and hence its final measure and test of validity? If it merely happens that knowing, when it is done with, passes into some action, by what miracle is the subsequent action so pat to the situation? Is it not rather true that the knowledge is instituted and framed in anticipation of the consequent issue, and in the degree in which it is wise and prudent, is held open to revision during it? Certainly the moralist, one might quote for example Goethe, Carlyle, and Mazzini, and the common man often agree that full knowledge, adequate assurance of reality, is found only in the issue which fulfills ideas, that we have to do a doctrine to know its truth. Otherwise, it is only dogma or doctrinaire program. Experimental science is a recognition that no idea is entitled to be termed knowledge till it has passed into such overt manipulation of physical conditions as constructs the object to which the idea refers. If one could get rid of one's traditional logic theories and set to work afresh to frame a theory of knowledge on the basis of the procedure of the common man, the moralist, and the experimentalist, would it be the forced or the natural procedure to say that the realities which we know, which we are sure of, are precisely those realities that have taken shape in and through the active procedures of knowing. End quote. So here he cites a couple of things. He cites the common man, and he says that he knew a physicist who was quite innocent of the pragmatic controversy. The physicist remarked that the knowledge of a mechanic or farmer was what the Yankee calls gumption, acknowledgement of things and their belongings and uses. In other words, knowing things, knowing where they belong, knowing how they should be used. Knowing things and the way that things fit into other things and the way things fit into the world. He says that's the knowledge of the mechanic, that's the knowledge of the farmer, and that's what the Yankee calls gumption. And the physicist says that, to his mind, natural science was gumption on a larger scale, the convenient cataloging and arranging of a whole lot of things with reference to their most efficacious services. In other words, what they do and how they affect things. Science is just the same thing, but an attempt to catalog more of everything rather than just the things that pertain to the mechanic or just the things that pertain to the farmer. And he talks a little bit more about how knowledge and judgment and good sense and reasonableness and intelligence are viewed popularly, and it seems to be that the common man views all of these things in terms of knowledge about things and how things work. Good sense is horse sense, ability to take hold of things right end up, to fit an instrument to an obstacle, to select resources apt for a task, to recognize obstacles and resources. Intelligence in its ordinary use is a practical term with respect to needs and possibilities. So, the common man views knowledge pragmatically. He says that the moralist and the common man often agree that full knowledge is found only in the issue which fulfills ideas. So the moralist, of course, saying that your ideas about morality only find their proof in your moral actions. So, in other words, the moralist agrees. Then he talks about the scientist and the experimental process, and he says, well, the scientist agrees also that you don't really know something until you've verified it by experiment. So in this sense, the scientist, the moralist, and the common man agree, and it's only the philosophical metaphysician who holds up some different strange theory of epistemology that doesn't agree with these things. He says, no one would deny that knowledge issues in some action which changes things to some extent, be the action only a more deliberate maintenance of a course of conduct already instinctively entered upon. And this is kind of like when I was talking about the step to the left in the last episode. If you know there's a step to the left, but you weren't planning on stepping to the left, it's just a bit of knowledge that you may somehow use, and the usefulness of the step to the left, if you're not planning on walking that way, is perhaps marginal. The knowledge of a poster on the wall is even less useful, but the possibility exists that the poster might contain some important information, or the possibility exists that you need to grab a piece of paper for some reason and you could pull the poster off the wall, or some undefined, let's say, potential use of the thing. And just in the same way that you know the step to the left because of the way it might potentially affect your behavior in some circumstance in which you wanted to step that way all of a sudden, the other things that surround you if you're in the coffee shop or wherever you are, the other things that are around you are the things that you could potentially act upon. And even to the sense that you see them to recognize the place. And if you find yourself waking up at a table you've been snoozing at, and you look around and you see the step and you see the poster and you see the barista, now you know where you are. So then you know how to get home, or you know that you should go order another drink to stay awake, whatever the case may be. you know things. The point is that you know things to act upon them or to potentially act upon them. And he says here, when I see a sign on a street corner, I can turn or go on, knowing what I am about. The perceptions of the scientist have no such overt or utilitarian uses, but surely after them he behaves differently as an inquirer, if in no other way. So you might be walking down the street and see a street sign, and you intend on just passing right by. Your intent is to just keep on walking. He says, no one would deny that knowledge issues in some action which changes things to some extent, be the action only a more deliberate maintenance of a course of conduct already entered upon. So that's why he brings up the street sign. If he's walking down the street, he might see the street sign and he might just more deliberately continue walking because now he knows he's in the right place. But again, as I pointed out, there's just so much. The street sign is one thing, but the bush and the leaf on the bush, they're not indicating quite so much. Is he walking more deliberately on his path? If he's never been on this path before, and there's a bush there, and he sees it, and the leaf on it, is the leaf influencing his path? Probably not. Probably not. But it remains a piece of knowledge for potential future use if he should be starving to death and looking for a leaf to munch on, or think maybe there's a bird in the bush. It's just things. It's just things that are lodged in your mind for purposes of drawing upon if you want to go down that street, or if you need to confirm you're going the right way, or if you want to tuck it away for some future use. At any rate, he says that knowing after the event makes a difference of this sort. In other words, knowing after you see the street sign or after you conduct the experience, when you learn something from what you've done or what you've experienced. So he says that knowing after the event makes a difference of this sort. Few, I suppose, would deny. If that were all pragmatism means, it would perhaps be accepted as a harmless truism. And sometimes it does seem like that. All the things I'm describing, you might say, well, that's obvious. That's the way the human mind works. It's just a harmless truism. But it is sort of interesting, the deeper questions that are prompted by this, when he says, there's a further question of fact. Just how is the consequent action related to the precedent knowledge? When is after the event? What degree of continuity exists? Is the difference between knowing and acting intelligently one of kind or simply one of dominant quality? And this comes down to the question of what is the sort of continuity here of observing something, knowing something, acting in the world, if knowledge is a pattern of mental activity. If knowledge is something that your neurons in your brain do, then knowledge is a material change in your brain that is prompted by material changes in your eyeballs when you see something. Material changes in the light waves and the photons, material changes in the thing on the table that you see, sends off the light waves, hits your cells in your eyeballs, sends a electrical pulse down a nerve inside your head, alters the connections of neurons in your brain, prompts various electrical stimuli there and release of various chemicals in your brain to prompt your neurons to grow and connect in certain ways and do whatever it is neurons do. Then those neurons in their various configurations steer activity in one way or another way, which then steers your body to do one thing or another thing. And in a sense, it's all a continuum. That sort of relates to an earlier essay, what he called an essay that is in this book, actually, that John Dewey wrote, really his first essay that is considered a pragmatist essay. It's called The Unit of Behavior, but has a secondary title. I think it was given to it where it was published elsewhere, called The Reflex Arc Concept in Psychology. And this essay is sort of about that same thing, where You see a flame, you reach out to touch the flame, you're burned by the flame, you learn something. Next time you see the flame, you don't reach out to touch it, your action's different. There's a stimulus, knowledge, response cycle. And yet, where are the lines that separate the stimulus, the knowledge, and the action from a biological point of view? It's all an ongoing process, and its activity occurs in different areas, from the hand to the eye to the mind. But isn't it all an ongoing circuit, a cycle, a connected sequence of events that is not entirely always easily separable? I mean, it is separable in some sense, but in another sense, it's all one cycle. And that's similar to what he's talking about here. He says the basic concepts that pragmatism prompts could sort of be looked at and said, well, that's a harmless truism. Everybody knows that. That's just the way the mind works. That's how things work. But some of the questions that are prompted by the initial ideas of pragmatism begin to develop it into a more interesting domain of psychological examination. And I point out again, as I point out so frequently, this is a long time ago. This is over 100 years ago, closing in on 120 years ago that this was written. And our knowledge of the human brain is certainly more advanced now than it was then. There are all sorts of experiments of psychology and whatnot that have occurred from then till now. So some of the questions perhaps that pragmatism was grappling with, because pragmatism grapples with psychology, obviously it grapples with knowing and knowledge and what that is and how it works. Perhaps some of these questions are more answered now than they were at the time. I'm not a psychologist and I can't speak to exactly what we know today about how the brain works, but I do think that some of these questions, if addressed today by a knowledgeable psychologist, would probably have some more information and some more answers to some of these questions. And actually, as a side note, that's definitely one of the reasons that I think pragmatism needs to be examined in a more perhaps political and sociological avenue than just a psychological avenue. If you're going to look at psychology, you certainly have a lot more to examine that's more recent information about how the mind works than just what William James and John Dewey were discussing back in the turn of the 20th century. At any rate, let's move to the next section. Here he says, quote, "It is a peculiar fact, a fact fit to stir curiosity, that the rational function seems to be intercalated in a scheme of practical adjustments. The parts and members of the organism are certainly not there primarily for pure intellection or for theoretic contemplation. The brain, the last physical organ of thought, is a part of the same practical machinery for bringing about adaptation of the environment to the life requirements of the organism, to which belong legs and hand and eye. That the brain frees organic behavior from complete servitude to immediate physical conditions, that it makes possible the liberation of energy for remote and ever-expanding ends, is indeed a precious fact, but not one which removes the brain from the category of organic devices of behavior. That the organ of thinking, of knowledge, was at least originally an organ of conduct, few, I imagine, will deny. And even if we try to believe that the cognitive function has supervened as a different operation, it is difficult to believe that the transfiguration has been so radical that knowing has lost all traces of its connection with vital impulse. But unless we so assume, have we any alternatives except to hold that this continual presence of vital impulse is a disturbing and refracting factor, which forever prevents knowledge from reaching its own aim, or else at a certain promoting, at a certain carrying forward of the vital impulse, importing certain differences in things, is the aim of knowledge. The problem cannot be evaded, save ostrich-wise, by saying that such considerations are merely genetic or psychological, having to do only with the origin and natural history of knowing. For the point is that the organic reaction, the behavior of the organism, affects the content of awareness. The subject matter of all awareness is thing related to organism, related as stimulus, direct or indirect, or as a material of response, present or remote, ulterior or achieved. No one, so far as I know, denies this with respect to the perceptual field of awareness. Pains, pleasures, hunger, and thirst are all secondary qualities, involve inextricably the interaction of organism and environment. The perceptual field is distributed and arranged as the possible field of selective reactions of the organism at its center. Up and down, far and near, before and behind, right and left, hard and soft, as well as white and black, bass and alto, involve reference to a center of behavior. This material has so long been the stock in trade of both idealistic arguments and proclamations of the agnostic relativity of knowledge that philosophers have grown aweary of listening. But even this lethargy might be quickened by a moderate hospitality to the pragmatic interpretation that red, or far and near, or hard and soft, or big and little, involves a relation between organism and environment is no more an argument for idealism than the fact that water involves a relation between hydrogen and oxygen. It is, however, an argument for the ultimately practical value of these distinctions, for they are differences made in what things would have been without organic behavior. Differences made not by consciousness or mind, but by the organism as the active center of a system of activities. Moreover, the whole agnostic sting of the doctrine of relativity lies in the assumption that the ideal or aim of knowledge is to repeat or copy a prior existence, in which case, of course, the making of contemporaneous differences by the organism in the very fact of awareness would get in the way and forever hinder the knowledge function from the fulfillment of its proper end. Knowledge, awareness, in this case, suffers from an impediment which no surgery can better. But if the aim of knowing be precisely to make certain differences in an environment, to carry on to favorable issue by the readjustment of the organism, certain changes going on indifferently in the environment, then the fact that the changes of the organism enter pervasively into the subject matter of awareness is no restriction or perversion of knowledge, but part of the fulfillment of its office. End quote. So what have we seen here? He says, just to start it off, it's a peculiar fact that the rational function seems to be intercalated in a scheme of practical adjustments. The parts and members of the organism are certainly not there primarily for pure intellection or for theoretical contemplation. In other words, your body parts, your arms, your legs, your heart, your lungs, those don't exist in order to facilitate intellectual activity or theoretic contemplation. He says it's the opposite of the fact, but that the brain is a part of your body and exists in order to help you adapt to your environment. He says the brain is a part of the same practical machinery for bringing about adaptation to the environment, to the life requirements of the organism, to which belong legs and hand and eye. He says that the organ of thinking, of knowledge, was at least originally an organ of conduct. Few, I imagine, will deny. In other words, everybody understands that at least at one point in time in our very early history, as living beings, the brain originally was a sort of guided people's conduct, or animals, creatures. It would guide creatures' conduct, as the brain of a mosquito guides its conduct. Nobody imagines that a mosquito engages in theoretical reflection. The brain of the mosquito simply guides its conduct. So he says the organ of thinking was originally an organ of conduct. Few will deny that. He says even if we try to believe that the cognitive function has supervened as a different operation, it's still difficult to believe that the transfiguration has been so radical that knowing has lost all traces of its connection with vital impulse. In other words, it's hard to imagine that knowing is completely disconnected from conduct, from the brain as a means of guiding conduct. Our fact of knowing hasn't completely escaped the organic world. Only the philosopher could believe that. Again, we think about Yankee gumption. Knowing is knowing where things fit in the world in order to accomplish the goals of the farmer or the mechanic. The common man has knowledge as a tool, as a sort of tool for making his way in the world. He knows things so that he can do things with his knowledge, and the things he does with his knowledge are first to feed himself and put a roof over his head, and then to procreate, and then to find enjoyment, and to act, to conduct himself in the world in some way. The common man understands knowledge to be connected in that way to conduct and action. He says, unless we assume that knowledge has lost all connection, unless we assume that it has lost all connection with our vitality, we have only two choices. We have only two alternatives. Number one is the alternative that the continual presence of a vital impulse is a disturbing and refracting factor, which forever prevents knowledge from reaching its own aim. So that the aim of knowledge as knowledge is to know the world completely. And our continual attempt to use knowledge for our own purposes, to steer knowledge, to examine this thing instead of that thing, is a disturbance. He says, unless we so assume, meaning unless we assume that knowledge has lost all traces of its connection with vital impulse, unless we so assume, have we any alternatives except to hold that this continual presence of vital impulse is a disturbing and refracting factor, which forever prevents knowledge from reaching its own aim? Or else, that a certain promoting, a certain carrying forward of the vital impulse, importing certain differences in things, is the aim of knowledge. You can only assume one of those two things, really. Those are your alternatives. Unless you think that our knowledge has completely become separated from our biological functions, completely become separated from our conduct and our activity, and is something that floats in the ether, disconnected from our human vital impulses. He says this problem cannot be evaded. He says the point is that the organic reaction, the behavior of the organism, affects the contents of awareness. The subject matter of all awareness is thing related to organism, related as stimulus, direct or indirect, or as material of response. He says no one denies this with regards to the perceptual field of awareness. Pain, pleasure, hunger, these are all inextricably connected. These are inextricably connected to the interaction between organism and environment. All of your perception is related to how you interact with your environment, how your environment interacts with you. And how you react to that is the center of how that is processed in your mind. He says the perceptual field is distributed and arranged as the possible field of selective reactions of the organism at its center. Up, down, far, near, before, behind, right, left, hard, soft. These all involve references to a center of behavior. They're all relative to you. All of your perceptions, obviously, are relative to you in the center and as an acting being. He says the whole agnostic sting of the doctrine of relativity lies in the assumption that the ideal or aim of knowledge is to repeat or copy a prior existence. So, in other words, relativity, the idea of relativity bothers people precisely because they think that the true objective of knowledge is objectivity, which is completely separate, for knowledge to be completely separate from any particular objective or drive. He says the whole agnostic sting of the doctrine of relativity lies in the assumption that the ideal or aim of knowledge is to repeat or copy a prior existence, in which case, of course, the making of contemporaneous differences by the organism in the very fact of awareness would get in the way of and forever hinder the knowledge function from the fulfillment of its proper end. Knowledge, awareness, in this case, suffers from an impediment which no surgery can better. But if the aim of knowing be precisely to make certain differences in an environment, to carry on to favorable issue by the readjustment of the organism, certain changes going on indifferently in the environment, then the fact that the changes of the organism enter pervasively into the subject matter of awareness is no restriction or perversion of knowledge, but part of the fulfillment of its office. So the fact that people are continually changing the environment, continually changing circumstances, continually advocating for this thing or that thing, the things that we know are impacted by us ourselves. He says that's not an impediment to knowledge, that's not some fatal flaw that no surgery can better, but is in fact the fulfillment of its function. Moving on with the discussion of awareness, he says, quote, "So far we have been dealing with awareness as a fact there like any fact, and have been concerned to show that the subject matter of awareness is, in any case, things in process of change, and in such change that the knowing function takes a hand in trying to guide it or steer it, so that some and not other consequences accrue. But what about the awareness itself? What happens when it is made the subject matter of awareness? What sort of a thing is it? It is, I submit, mere sophistication, futile at that, to argue either that we cannot become aware of awareness without involving ourselves in an endless regress, or that whenever we are aware of anything, we are thereby necessarily aware of awareness once for all, so that it has no character, save a purely formal and empty one. Taken concretely, awareness is an event with certain specifiable conditions. We may indeed be aware of it formally, as a bare fact, just as we may be cognizant of an explosion without knowing anything of its nature. But we may also be aware of it in a curious and analytic spirit, undertaking to study it in detail. This inquiry, like any other inquiry, proceeds by determining conditions and consequences. Here, awareness is a characteristic fact, presenting to inquiry in its own characteristic earmarks. And a valid knowledge of awareness is the same sort of thing as valid knowledge of the spectrum or of a trotting horse. It proceeds generically in the same way and must satisfy the same generic tests. What, then, is awareness found to be? The following answer, dogmatically summary in form, involves positive difficulties, and glides over many points where our ignorance is still too great, but it represents a general trend of scientific inquiry, carried on, I hardly need to say, on its own merits, without respect to the pragmatic controversy. Awareness means attention, and attention means a crisis of some sort, in an existent situation, a forking of the roads of some material, a tendency to go this way or that. It represents something the matter, something out of gear, or in some way menaced, insecure, problematical, and strained. This state of tension, of ambiguous indications, projects, and tendencies, is not merely in the mind, it is nothing merely emotional, it is in the facts of the situation as transitive facts. The emotional or subjective disturbance is just a part of the larger disturbance. And if, employing the language of psychology, we say that attention is a phenomenon of conflicting habits, being the process of resolving this conflict by finding an act which functions all the factors concerned, this language does not make the facts merely psychological, whatever that means. The habits are as biologic as they are personal, and as cosmic as they are biologic. They are the total order of things expressed in one way, just as a physical or chemical phenomenon is the same order expressed in another way. The statement, in terms of conflict and readjustment of habits, is at most one way of locating the disturbance in things. It furnishes no substitute for or rival of reality and no psychical duplication. If this be true, then awareness, even in its most perplexed and confused state, that of maximum doubt and precariousness of subject matter, means things entering, via the particular thing known as organism, into a peculiar condition of differential or additive change. How can we refuse to raise and consider the question of how things in this condition are related to the prior state which emerges into it, and to the subsequent state of things into which it issues? End quote. So here he's really just saying, well, let's look at awareness for a minute, and let's try and see what awareness is. He says it's not valid to say, well, we can't really become aware of awareness because that's an infinite, endless regress. And we can't really say that when we're aware of anything at all, by default we're aware of awareness because our awareness participates in the awareness of the thing, and therefore there's nothing to be aware of in awareness. Both of those are sort of dodges. He says awareness is a thing in the world that you can be vaguely aware of it, like you're aware of an explosion, although you don't know anything else about it, what caused it. You haven't seen it. You just know about it. Someone told you, perhaps. Vaguely aware of it. You heard a sound. But you can be aware of awareness in a more curious and analytic spirit and study it. And studying it would reveal that it is a characteristic fact of reality, and an inquiry into it would be in the same way that you would inquire into a trotting horse or the spectrum of colors. It's just a thing in the world that can be studied in the same way as any other thing in the world. And then what is it? Well, he says the following answer, dogmatically summary in form, involves positive difficulties and glides over many points where ignorance is still too great. We don't really know yet entirely 1908 what awareness is, but it seems to be attention. And attention is a crisis in some sort in our circumstance. And this ties back to some of the things that William James talked about in some of his very early essays. And I think it's somewhat similar to things that Peirce had talked about, where you're thinking because there's a problem that you want to solve. And it may be a very simple problem. You're reaching into your pocket to determine whether you're going to pay with 5 pennies or a nickel when you get a carriage ride. And it's not a big problem, but you turn it over in your head real quickly. Do I want to save these pennies for any reason, or do I want to make my pocket have less change in it? I make a quick decision and pay either with the 5 pennies or with the nickel. I wasn't thinking about the change in my pocket until I had to pay the fare, and then I had a dilemma. It wasn't a major dilemma, but I gave it a moment's thought, and then after I resolved it, I paid the fare, and then I stopped thinking about the change in my pocket once again. In other words, my awareness of the change in my pocket my awareness was only directed to that because I had a problem. And even if I didn't have a problem that I was going to think about, even if I just had to pay the fare, my awareness still goes to the change in my pocket because the carriage man has his hand out and he wants to get paid. I'm aware of the carriage man with his hand out, waiting to get paid, because that is a problem for me. He wants something from me. I have to become aware of it. He's made himself a figure in my field of vision with a gesture that I'm expected to interpret. I become aware of him. I have to be aware of him. I can't completely ignore the carriage man because that will create further problems for me. So my awareness goes to him, then my awareness goes to myself. Oh, where's my change? Oh, it's in my pocket. I think about my pocket. I think about the change in my pocket. I think about how to get into my pocket. I'm aware of my hand. I'm aware of fiddling around in the pocket trying to get the change. I'm aware of dropping the coins into his hand. I'm aware of the things that need to be resolved. I give attention to the things that are some sort of problems. And these aren't always, like I said, major problems. Clearly, paying the fare for the carriage is not a major problem. But essentially, anytime there's any sort of disturbance whatsoever, your awareness is driven to that. And we're beings that are constantly searching for disturbances. That's how we've survived. We search for the disturbance, and then we resolve the disturbance, and then we search for the next one. And our awareness is constantly jumping around in that way. So let's keep moving again to the last section I'm reading from this essay, continuing to talk about awareness. And this part becomes kind of difficult to interpret. I'll read it, and I'll attempt to interpret it, and maybe you'll get something out of this that I'm missing. He says, quote, "Suppose the case to be awareness of a chair. Suppose that this awareness comes only when there is some problematic affair in which the chair is in some way, in whatever degree of remoteness concerned. It may be a wonder whether it is a chair at all, or whether it is strong enough to stand on, or where I shall put it, or whether it is worth what I paid for it, or, as not infrequently happens, the situation involved in uncertainty may be some philosophic matter in which the perception of the chair is cited as evidence or illustration. Humorously enough, awareness of it may even be cited in the course of a philosophic argument intended to show that awareness has nothing to do with situations of incompleteness and ambiguity. Now, what of the change the chair undergoes in entering this way into a situation of perplexed inquiry? Is this any part of the genuineness of that chair with which we are concerned? If not, where is the change found? In something totally different called consciousness? In that case, how can the operations of inquiry, of observation and memory and reflection, ever have any assurance of getting referred back to the right object? Positively, the presumption is that the chair of which we are speaking is the chair of which we are speaking. It is the same thing that is out there, which is also involved in the doubtful situation. Moreover, the reference to consciousness as the exclusive locus of the doubt only repeats the problem. For consciousness, by the theory under consideration, means, after all, only the chair as concerned in the problematical situation. The physical chair remains unchanged, you may say. Surely, if, as is altogether likely, what is meant by physical is precisely that part of the chair as object of total awareness which remains unaffected, for certain possible purposes, by entering for certain other actual purposes into the situation of awareness. But how can we segregate, antecedently to experimental inquiry, the physical chair from the chair which is now the object to be known? Into what contradictions do we fall when we attempt to define the object of one awareness not in its own terms, but in terms of a selected type of object, which is the appropriate subject matter of some other cognizance? End quote. So what in the world is he talking about here? This is more difficult. He's essentially saying, let's say we're thinking about a chair. Let's say we're aware of a chair. The question is the awareness of the chair. There may be any sort of problems that prompt you to think about the chair. Where are you going to put the chair? Can you stand on the chair? How much did you pay for the chair? You might be... The problem of the chair might be that it is the subject of some philosophic matter when you're discussing awareness of a chair. Now, anyway, when the chair becomes the question or the component of a problem, what sort of change has the chair undergone as it enters into a situation of perplexed inquiry? He says, is this any part of the genuineness of that chair with which we are concerned? And if not, where's the change found? In something totally different called consciousness? So, in other words, there's the chair. You're unconcerned with it. Now you need to change the light bulb. Now you look at the chair and you say, is that chair going to support my weight? Now you have a problem. You have a question about the chair. The chair has entered your consciousness. Is it a quality of the chair that it is being contemplated by you. When you're thinking about the chair and you're thinking about whether or not you can stand on it, what is the nature of the change in the chair entering into your consciousness? You might say, and you probably would, the chair doesn't change when it enters your consciousness changes. You're now thinking about the chair. Obviously, the chair, in its genuineness, in its chairness, hasn't changed. Nothing physical has changed about the chair. He says, where's this change found? In something totally different called consciousness? In that case, how can the operations of inquiry, of observation, and memory, and reflection ever have any assurance of getting referred back to the right object? And there's a question that is hard to understand. How can you be certain? It seems as though he's saying, how can you be certain that you're questioning about the chair, you're thinking about the chair, you're evaluating about the chair, well, you're actually thinking about the right chair? How do you know you're thinking about this chair if there's not some sort of connection between you and the chair? He says, positively, the presumption is that the chair of which we are speaking is this chair of which we are speaking. And it's kind of peculiar. He writes it slightly differently, where he connects the word chair in the first instance. Chair of which we are speaking is all connected with dashes. It's a concept. Chair of which we are speaking. So the mental chair is the same chair that you're talking about. The chair, in an easier way, obviously, to say this would be that the chair in your mind, as your subject of contemplation, is the same thing as the chair in the room with you that is being contemplated. He says, positively, the presumption is that the chair is the chair. It's the same thing out there, which is also involved in the doubtful situation. Moreover, the reference to consciousness as the exclusive locus of the doubt only repeats the problem. For consciousness, by the theory under consideration, means, after all, only the chair as concerned in the problematical situation. What does that mean? Well, as we've discussed, consciousness or awareness or attention, it only comes about when a certain circumstance causes it to come about. He says the physical chair remains unchanged, you may say. Surely if, as is altogether likely, what is meant by physical is precisely that part of the chair as object of total awareness which remains unaffected for certain possible purposes by entering for certain other actual purposes into the situation of awareness. So in other words, what you mean by physical chair is all of the aspects of the chair excluded by your consciousness. The parts of the chair that you can't really be conscious of, that can't fit inside your brain. The concept of the chair you can think about. The chair as a material object can't really be thought about. You can think about the idea of the chair. You can tie the idea of the chair to the chair, but the chair itself, it doesn't get in your head. It remains on the floor. He says the physical, surely, as is altogether likely, what is meant by physical is precisely that part of the chair as object of total awareness, which remains unaffected for certain possible purposes by entering for certain other actual purposes into the situation of awareness. But how can we segregate antecedently to experimental inquiry the physical chair from the chair which is now the object to be known? Into what contradictions do we fall when we attempt to define the object of one awareness, not in its own terms, but in terms of a selected type of object, which is the appropriate subject matter of some other cognizance? In other words, how can we define the chair as the thing uncontemplated when the contemplation is a necessary component of that definition? And that's where it starts to seem like nonsense to me. There's clearly two separate things. There's the chair in the room, and there's the chair in your head, and the chair in your head is related to the chair in the room, but there's no ongoing connection. If you see the chair, the photons that bounce off the chair and enter your eyes in a certain pattern create an image on your retina. Your brain interprets that image as a chair in the room. You then close your eyes. There's no more photons connecting. Your memory holds the pattern. Your neurons hold the pattern of the chair in an approximation. You might not see the back of the chair. Perhaps the back of the chair is painted blue. Perhaps you don't know that because you didn't see the back of the chair. The chair in your mind doesn't have a back painted blue. It only has a version of the chair that your brain builds out of the electrical stimuli that come to it from your eyeball. There's a pattern held in your brain that is a representation of the chair. It's an approximation of the chair, and you can manipulate the chair in your brain as necessary, imagining yourself standing on it. But there's no ongoing connection between the chair and the chair in your mind once the photons have entered your eye and the pattern has been repeated. Any more than when you Xerox a page, you carry the Xerox off and the original page goes back on the library shelf, the connection is over. And I don't understand really what the point is in attempting to contemplate it or to invent strange metaphysical reasons for wondering what the connection is. And maybe that's just the part I don't understand, why that would even be a subject of discussion. I guess for contemplative purposes, it's interesting to think about, but common sense tells me the answer is obvious. There is no ongoing connection, and there's no part of the chair that's affected. Of course, it is a quality of a thing in its relation to something else, in a sense. The book is next to the television. Now, the book on its own, as a book, doesn't have a connection to the television other than a relationship. It's next to the television. Is that a quality of the book? No, it's a relationship. There's certain relationships with other things that you could extract, and the physical book wouldn't change. If you picked the television up and moved it, the relationship would change, but the book wouldn't change. Can you know everything there is to know about the book without knowing that it's next to the television? How crucial is that relationship to the book? I think there's clearly a difference between the qualities of the book that don't depend on anything else and the qualities of the book that do depend on other things. The book is in the box. The book is on the shelf. But those are relationships. And I think it's just a fundamentally different sort of thing. Anyhow, thanks for listening. I'm not going to draw any further conclusions about that other than it's interesting to think about. To me, it does point back to sort of determinism, although that may not be what John Dewey is getting at. Maybe the early pragmatists were not determinists. Maybe they were against determinism. But to me, a lot of what John Dewey is saying here continues to drive back to the point that consciousness, mental activity, knowledge are all fundamentally material, physical phenomena. Awareness itself is a material, physical phenomena. It's all material. And the material is all part of ongoing processes and is constantly subject to stimuli and has its own processes triggered by the stimuli that unfold themselves, constantly being subject to new stimuli and have results in material changes in the world. All of it seems extremely materialistic. and deterministic when I read it and I understand it. And I have a hard time envisioning a pragmatism that is not materialistic. But maybe that's just my interpretation. At any rate, thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk to you again next time.